Let's have a look at this image together. What do we see here? Well, it's a pedestrian walkway in Hong Kong. You might have already recognized the brick pavement here, so yes, we are in Causeway Bay. But look closer. Do you see something odd here? Can you find something unusual? If you look carefully, you see a little curb in the middle of the sidewalk, a leftover of a pedestrian edge, a border that has no function anymore. So how did it get there? Or more interestingly, why is it still there? Well, one could say this curb wonderfully portrays a gap of time, as it tells you about the extensive urban developments of Hong Kong's northern coastline. But it also tells you stories. It tells you stories about shifting street directions. It tells you stories about changing coastlines due to land reclamation. So let's have a look at these stories together. In the next 10 minutes, I will take you on a journey through Hong Kong. In this journey, we will look at more of these leftover objects in Hong Kong. And I promise you, this will change the way you look at the city. But be aware, what you're going to see requires a little bit of creative thinking. But before we go any further, believe it or not, these leftover objects, they have a name. A quirky name indeed. They're called Thomasons. But what is actually a Thomason? A Thomason is an architectural leftover that can be found in all cities around the globe. It was only a few years ago that a friend of mine, Professor Daniel, an architectural historian in Kyoto, he told me about the rich, yet not so well-known history about these Thomasons. So the story goes like this. In the 70s, the Japanese artist Genpei Akasegawa and his art students walked through the streets of Tokyo and found these random leftover objects. They knew they found something spectacular like this one, a staircase that leads up to something what appears to be a window, so it leads nowhere. So they found objects that unintentionally survived the change of time and became purposeless. They lost their function. So why have they called it Thomasons? Well, you should know Akasegawa was a huge baseball fan. And Thomasons is actually an ironic homage to an American baseball player, Gary Thomason. Gary was actually a great baseball player, but as soon as he got hired by a Japanese baseball team, on a huge salary, by the way, he hardly ever hit the ball. So Akasegawa, with a lot of underlying respect, but humor, obviously, he thought this is the perfect metaphor for these leftover objects because they're quite expensive, either to dismantle or to maintain, but rather useless, besides being a Thomason. So generally speaking, these Thomasons, they capture stories about the city and its citizens. It can tell you stories about neglection, stories about oblivion, but also about resurrection, as we will see later on. So how could we get so excited about such functionless, useless objects like this art student from Akasegawa when she found this mailbox here cemented into the facade? Well, the secret is curiosity. And this is actually the fitting link to the course I'm teaching here at HKU. Because a year ago, Professor Chris Webster, with Matthew Pryor and myself, we have launched the faculty interdisciplinary courses. In these courses, we introduce our students, as the name suggests, to the interdisciplinary links of the built environment profession, but more importantly, we make our students curious about the city they are living in. And by far, the most interesting activity in these courses was to send our students out to the streets of Hong Kong to look out for these useless structures, what appears to be useless. When we have started this activity, we did not even know how many Thomasons were out there because no one before recorded them in Hong Kong. So when our students walked extensively the streets of Hong Kong for weeks and weeks and went to the archives, we did the research, and they came back with their discoveries, it absolutely blew our minds. The amount and variety of Thomasons in Hong Kong is astonishing. You have to imagine there are Thomasons out there as tiny as this little pipe holder on the facade, but also Thomasons as big as a bathroom. I know this is still relatively small if you know Hong Kong's bathroom sizes, but still, here, the interesting thing is actually not the informal extension, but it's actually the maintenance of the building. They repainted the facade and thereby included this bathroom into the whole building structure. It's absolutely phenomenal. There are Thomasons out there which are meters high, decades old, tucked between the old and the new structures. There are Thomasons even with the size of a house. In this case, Akasegawa would have called it the atomic Thomasons, because it looks like it's the survivor of an atomic bomb test. So amazed by this treasure box, we really needed a way to categorize them in order to better understand and appreciate the varieties. Thomasons have a very strict definition framework. They are firstly, they need to be completely functionless. So over time, for whatever reason, they have lost their function. And secondly, they need to be regularly maintained. That's a very strict definition framework. But as we know Hong Kong and its rapidly changing urban fabric, it was quite hard to find these things, as you can imagine. So imagine you were looking out on the streets, you're trying to find these leftover objects. They could appear and literally disappear within days, weeks, sometimes months, but rarely years. So having said that, it came with a huge surprise to us that some of these Thomasons actually resisted these cliches and turned themselves into something new. Maintained or neglected, we want to picture those Thomasons through their life cycle. So in this case, in this example, as you can see here, the staircase, it had a clear purpose. We want to picture this staircase as a circle. Let's call it a quarter of a circle because it has a very short life cycle, a very short lifespan. In this case, the owners of the flat, they have changed the spatial arrangements over time for whatever reason, because the staircase used to be the main entrance to the flat. But now it has become completely useless, besides being an amphitheater for mice and rats. So to keep this exercise simple, I've used another staircase Thomason to illustrate the move from a quarter of a circle to actually half a life circle for a slightly longer lifespan. In this case, it was meant to be a recreational park on top of these stairs, but as you can see, it never got finished. So these stairs have lost their purpose. They're there, you can climb them up. They don't really offer you a nice view, but they are maintained, they're cleaned, they're regularly used, but differently used. Not as stairs, but as sitting opportunities. I took this picture about 2 years ago on my way to HKU. As you can see, it shows an old stone brick wall, a typical Hong Kong banyan tree with its root network, and a little bit of steel infrastructure in between. No big deal, right? But it was only after the rediscovery of our students that we realized the depth of this Thomason. And by depth, I mean its layers of history. Because if you would walk around the corner just here in Sai Pun, you would see this. A gated entrance to an air raid shelter. So just around the corner here, in other words, there's a bunker from the Second World War. It's phenomenal, no? According to the research of our students, there are only a few bunkers left in Hong Kong, and a handful of those, they have turned themselves into something new, into wine storages. Unfortunately, we didn't get access to one of these wine storages because due to the lack of time, but therefore this is not a story of disappearance or neglection, but it's actually of resurrection. Some of these historical relevant places in Hong Kong, they have the possibility to turn themselves into something completely new for future purposes. So after this journey through Hong Kong, let's go back to the beginning, to our little curb in Causeway Bay. And I hope you realize now the stories it could offer you, the layers of history that it provides you. You just need to be curious enough to listen to them. So I want to end this talk with a quote by Akasegawa, an artist who raised awareness to the importance of curiosity and collaboration, because only through careful observation and paying attention to details within our city, we really understand the complexity of our built environment. So finally, I only hope that it will help to spread the instinct to better observe the world around us. Because you need to know there are so many more Thomasons out there for you to find. Thank you very much.